it. Robert Saleh is not going to be the Jacksonville Jaguars head coach. Liam Coen is the Jacksonville Jaguars head coach. And it looks like Robert Saleh most likely will be the 49ers defensive coordinator. Chase, what'd you think?
Well, it was a pretty crazy U-turn from Liam Coen because 2 days ago he had backed out of the running of that Jaguars job, and then Shad Khan fires Trent Baalke, and then I guess that got Liam Coen interested once again in the Jags job. And in the meantime, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers were willing to give Liam Coen the biggest contract for a coordinator in NFL history. They gave him the contract. He never signed it. And then he went dark. He goes to Jacksonville, secretly meets with Shad Khan, and then he becomes a Jaguars head coach. All while that was happening, Robert Saleh, according to reports, was putting a staff together thinking that he was going to be the next head coach of the Jacksonville Jaguars. And then Saleh, who was supposed to have his second interview on Friday, used to be the linebackers coach with Jacksonville, gets wind that now the Jags are going to go back to Coen, hire him as the head coach, and that results in Saleh not getting that job. And now it looks as though the stars are aligning after a crazy turn of events where Saleh is going to return to San Francisco. The Niners were pretty risky about this because they went all in on Robert Saleh, really with no backup plan. They had formal interviews with 3 people, Saleh, Brandon Staley, and Deshae Townsend of the Lions staff. And if Saleh got that Jags job, I have no idea where they would have gone. Tim Kawakami had reported that they were having conversations in the building about bringing in Pete Carroll as a defensive coordinator here on this Friday morning. He gets hired by the Las Vegas Raiders. So this is one of those moments where you're like, wow, the NFL is king. This league is crazy. Wild things happen. And now the Niners are going to get their guy, it seems, and they're going to make him the highest paid defensive coordinator in the National Football League.
And he essentially is going to be the head coach of the 49er defense. And it's interesting because Kyle Shanahan said, we're open to a scheme switch, but I never really bought it. Because I know how much they like Chris Kasarik, and I know Chris is an advocate of that 4-3 version of the 4-3, the wide 9. You can say you're willing to switch, but I thought the Niners, were trying once again to serve multiple masters. They don't want to get rid of Johnny Holland. They don't want to get rid of Daniel Bullocks. They don't want to get rid of Chris Kasarik. They don't want to switch from the 4-3 to the 3-4. They wanted to stay with the 4-3. They wanted to stay with the wide 9. They wanted to stay with their coaches. If you have that many parameters that you're trying to satisfy, yeah, it's going to be a very unique candidate that's totally okay with the existing coaches. It's a big loyalty thing in the NFL. Everybody's like, I want my guys. I want guys that are loyal to me. And so, there's this thing, even though Shanahan made it seem, Chase, like, we'll leave no stone unturned. I just think that that's something at that point that he wanted to say because he knew they won 6 games, and it doesn't look good to be super rigid. You want to be open-minded at that point. But my sense of it is they never really were interested in switching the scheme. They were all in on Saleh. The question is if Saleh – this Coen thing worked out brilliantly. If by chance Coen doesn't do this about face, I think the 49ers probably have to wait till after Super Bowl 59 if Buffalo or Philadelphia advance because of the presence of Kellen Moore and Joe Brady and the potential that they would be candidates. And, man, if you're the Niners, you want to get on with it. It's that you got to make all kinds of additions personnel-wise. You didn't want to wait until middle of February to get this show rolling. And essentially, that's what happened yesterday. They went from potentially having to wait until mid-February post-Super Bowl to they could probably get this done in the next 48 hours.
Yeah, and I remember 2 off seasons ago for San Francisco, I was in Glendale, Arizona for Super Bowl 57. That was the year that the Eagles had lost to the Kansas City Chiefs. And during that week, that was when Steve Wilkes became the 49ers defensive coordinator. And I had talked to people like Jay Glazer, and they said that people around the NFL were talking about it as one of the best overall moves that any franchise had made up to that point in the offseason. And then, of course, that didn't really work out. And then obviously last year they got that late start because they made it to the Super Bowl the year before they made it to the NFC Championship game. And so the processes have been delayed. And I thought that was a little bit of a concern for San Francisco because Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch were saying during that end of the season press conference, it's going to be nice to have a full off season where we can kind of reset. And we have a full off season to rebuild, tinker this roster a little bit, make some coaching changes. Yet the season ended for the Niners 3 weeks ago. And you were talking about how Kyle Shanahan didn't want to leave any stone unturned. He turned over 3 stones for this defensive coordinator search with those 3 formal interviews. And so the more that this dragged on, I was starting to get a little bit concerned because if Saleh had spurned them and if he got that Jags job, there was no chatter about who the backup plan was going to be. And I had kind of an inclination it was going to be Brandon Staley, which I thought would be a very uninspiring hire. I know that Diamador Lenore and some others were big fans of his, and he's a Vic Fangio disciple. Fangio has done wonders with that Eagles defense this year, and Fangio brought him to Chicago, brought him to Denver. Sean McVay, I trust his evaluation of coaches, and Staley did a good job as a DC there, but his stint with the Chargers was kind of a disaster. And so this worked out about as well as it could have for the Niners in bringing in arguably the number 1 defensive coordinator on the market. The Niners defense in 2024, Larry, was so mistake prone, sloppy, poorly coached. They were so vanilla and predictable. And even though they're not going to change the scheme, I think that Saleh's going to be more aggressive. And I think an elite defensive coordinator and a good surrounding coaching staff, and I do believe they have some good coaches on that side of the ball. They put players in a position to succeed. They help develop youth talent. And Saleh has been able to do that, and he's shown that he can do that. I also want to revisit the point that you made. He's going to be the head coach of the defense. I think this Niners team needs that. And Tim Kawakami had said that in this piece when he was talking about Pete Carroll, that the buzzword that kept coming up was energy. Well, Robert Saleh has juice and energy on that sideline. That has been missing the last 2 years. Saleh's going to be able to bring that to the table. I know some people wanted to change the scheme, but scheme familiarity, it wasn't an issue, the scheme, when Saleh was with the Jets. And so now he has some familiar faces in Nick Bosa and Fred Warner to continue that scheme. Chris Kosaric is still here. Some really good positional coaches. I think you have a pretty good defensive core with Nick Bosa, Fred Warner, Diamador Lenore, Renardo Green, Malik Mustafa. There's no doubt they need to add some talent and depth, especially at defensive tackle and edge rusher. But revisiting the scheme, it is a scheme that still works. Like the Jets defense under Saleh, first in points per drive, first in EPA per play, third in success rate. He got fired, and the Jets defense was just awful. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing what Saleh is going to be able to bring to the table. What the Niners have to do, though, is have a contingency plan in place because they have to imagine that Saleh is going to be in the running for a head coaching job in a year or two, and they can't continue to go through this type of problematic cycle.
Yeah, I mean, if you could have somebody in-house that you could hand it to so that you have continuity. But I think continuity is the name of the game here. I mean, why were the Niners all in on Robert Saleh? I mean, personality is part of it, but I think also they like their scheme. They like Chris. They don't want to change out all their D linemen. Matt Mayoko said that he feels that Brandon Staley doesn't appear as if he'll be back with the 49ers. You know, and it's funny because, you know, there were so many people losing their mind about Brandon Staley. Like Brandon Staley was the worst thing ever. Brandon Staley had 1 year as a defensive coordinator. They were number 1 in points, number 1 in yards. Now, as a head coach, he went for it an awful lot on 4th down. And, you know, really, I think kind of, you know, showed that he was a little too analytics driven, I think. Yeah. But, you know, in talking to him this summer, the guy was clearly a smart guy. What did you, I mean, in Demo Lenore, Mitchell Ness says, Larry was justifying Staley. No, I was trying to be critical of the people who are like, he's an absolute disaster. It's like, dude, based on what? I mean, based on what? What did he do this year that was so bad? I mean, did Renardo Green develop? He worked with the corners. I thought the Niner corners, for the most part, got better as the year went on. I thought there were some really good things. I thought Renardo Green played kind of like a veteran. So I don't know that he did a terrible job with the Niners. He definitely did an amazing job in his 1 year as the coordinator with the Rams. You can rip on his head coaching, tenure with the Chargers, clearly, but to me, the fit was always awkward with Brandon Staley. And I'll say this: when Shanahan said at the end of the year presser that that Brandon Staley was going to get an interview, it was so obvious that he was not getting the job. I mean, it was like he said it, but he said it in a way was like, yeah, we're going to give Brandon an interview, and it sounded like this guy has spent a lot of time here this year, and because of that respect for that time, we're going to give him an interview. But it really sounded like he had no chance for the job.
Yeah, and I know I was one of the people over the last week or two in talking about this defensive coordinator search where I was like, man, if they don't get Saleh, what are the other options? They haven't reached out to Dennis Allen. Lou Anarumo went to the Indianapolis Colts. They didn't reach out to Matt Eberflus. They interviewed Deshae Townsend. I thought it was weird how the Lions staff got gutted and all of their coaches were getting poached and taken by their assistants to the organizations that they went to. Ben Johnson to Chicago, Aaron Glenn to New York, yet nobody carried Deshae Townsend with them. And so that was a little bit weird, but they really weren't doing an exhaustive search at all. And as far as Brandon Staley goes, look, Vic Fangio is one of the best defensive minds in the history of the NFL. What he has overseen, how he has coached the Philadelphia Eagles this year, has been one of the most impressive jobs that I have seen ever in football, given how bad the Eagles defense was in 2023. And they've literally turned it around to the point where they're the number one defense in the NFL. And so when a guy like Vic Fangio brings Brandon Staley to Chicago, and then Vic Fangio gets the head coaching job at the Denver Broncos and brings Brandon Staley with him. And when Brandon Staley gets hired by Sean McVay to be a defensive coordinator, and I know that 2020 season was a little bit wonky, COVID year, limited training camp practices, no preseason games, there were no fans at stadiums for the most part. A lot of stats were inflated. But at the same time, that was the case for the opposition too. And Brandon Staley's defense with the Rams was good. And I know that sometimes he's a little bit nerdy and he's very analytical. And there are always those camera shots of him doing stretches pregame as the head coach of the Los Angeles Chargers. And he thinks about the game in a very analytical, nuanced way. And that can rub people the wrong way. But I do think that he's a pretty good coach. I just thought it was very awkward from the jump. And you think back to how the Niners went about the defensive coordinator search last year. They lose the Super Bowl. I don't think Steve Wilkes was to blame. I think the offense, the lack of execution, Kyle Shanahan getting outcoached by Steve Spagnuolo, and then the Niners shooting themselves in the foot was the real reason why the Niners lost that game. But anyway, they fire Steve Wilkes, who statistically the defense performed well outside of it struggling against the run. And then Kyle Shanahan tries to get Bill Belichick. He tried to get Spags. He tried to get Jeff Ulbrich. Whiff. And so they're so late in the process where they're like, okay, what do we do? Let's internally promote Nick Sorensen to be the defensive coordinator. But then they brought in Brandon Staley. And for Staley, that had to have been awkward. For Sorensen, it had to have been awkward because I kind of looked at it as this, right? We're going to promote Nick Sorensen, who has no defensive coordinator experience at all. The only coordinator experience he has was as a special teams coordinator under Urban Meyer with the Jacksonville Jaguars. And they brought in Staley to a point where it's like, well, if Sorensen doesn't work out, we can always pivot to Staley. It's like, if I get hired by a company, I want the company to believe in me. But if they were to hire me, but then hire somebody else to kind of hold my hand and help me and be a contingency plan if I didn't work out, that wouldn't instill confidence in me. And I don't think Nick Sorensen really coached in a confident way. So, look, I don't think Staley will be back with this coaching staff. I thought it was a little bit of a weird hire at the time. I think he's going to be able to land on his feet. I'm not closing the book on him being a defensive coordinator in this league. But Robert Saleh, I think, is going to bring in his own coaching staff, and he has the right to do that. They're going to make him the highest paid DC in the game, and he should be able to build up the staff as he sees such.
It's interesting. Everybody is crushing Staley, but the thing about Staley is that this is the way football works. I mean, when I was working in the Canadian League, we hired a bunch of coaches that had NFL pedigree and scouts that had NFL pedigree that just they had lost their jobs in the NFL, and they just didn't want to be out of the game. Right? They wanted to be working in the game, something on their resume that said that they were working. So I think all of the hires that happen in the springtime late, or anything that happens between the draft and camp, I mean, that's usually like, hey, man, I'm doing you a favor. Like 49ers did Brandon Staley a favor by hiring him, giving him a place to go so he could have something to do. He had no job for the year. He had offset language. He had money coming in. You know what I mean? So I never looked at it like, oh, he's really going to take Sorensen's job. Sorensen it was his job, but it was awkward. You're right, because Staley had done the job and Sorensen had not done the job. But this happens a lot around pro football, where coaches and scouts and executives sometimes, do what Robert Saleh did. You know what? My gig ended, but I don't want to sit on the couch, so I'll go work for Green Bay, or I'll go work for somebody. And it's like, what role are you doing? Well, you know what? You're just coming here, and we'll figure it out when you get here.
Yep.
So I think there was an awful lot of people, and yet I'm going to share the screen because to me this was the most compelling moment of the year as far as Brandon Staley was concerned. Here's what Demo had to say about him.
You've been working with Brandon Staley for the first time. He's working with you one-on-one a lot. What's your impression of him so far?
Oh, he's a genius. I really respect him, as a coach, as a person, the joy he brings to our room, and with just the knowledge, of teaching us so many things, it's a blessing to have him there.
Something specific that you've learned from him that you're just like, wow, I never thought of this like that before, or something?
Playing the angles of football, and playing the percentages. He kind of told me like the percentages of you getting a fade every down is less likely. So why would you play that, with the start of the downs? Actually think when you out there, you already got the talent. Just, use your brain and the plays will come.
So there you go. Now some people are like, well, what do you expect him to say? Okay, we could say that about anybody, but ultimately, I've been around Demo a lot the last few years.
Yeah.
Demo's a straight shooter. He's not going to just say, he would have just answered that like, hey, he's all right. He went on and on and on and specifically cited things of what Staley did. So, it's easy for CJ, who I love CJ, but Staley sucks. Or, somebody in here, oh, you're pumping up Staley. Don't listen to me. Listen to Demo. Demo, I mean, I don't think Brandon Staley is nearly as bad as 49er fans seem to think Brandon Staley is. But
No.
whatever. He's not going to be the defensive coordinator. Saleh's going to be the guy. Unless Saleh gets some 11th hour head coaching opportunity. What do you make of what Coen did as far as he kind of secured an offer from Tampa, told Jacksonville no, I guess because he didn't like Trent Baalke. Jacksonville responds by firing Trent Baalke, and then all of a sudden Liam Coen goes dark on the Buccaneers, and they can't reach him. And then he made up some excuse. So he had some illness thing with his kid, and that, it's like, it sounded really, really bad. Like,
Yeah.
it's the end does not justify the means. I mean, how you get to where you're going is as important as your destination when it comes to your reputation within the sport. Did Liam Coen? He got the job. Did he cost himself his reputation the last couple of days?
I've always said this. I think life is all about upward mobility, and anybody who loves what they do professionally and anybody who has dreams and aspirations, they will have to make sacrifices and work really hard to get to where they want to get to. And when those opportunities present themselves, you just can't turn them down. And so I don't think that Coen handled this the way that I would handle it if I was with an employer that helped me change the course of my career, and they treated me well and they compensated me well and they were willing to make me the highest paid offensive coordinator in the game. I would probably be upfront with them because I would know how it would look on me at the end of the day in a way where Coen, I don't think, communicated that. And so he comes away with this with a little bit of egg on his face, and he probably didn't handle it in the most professional way. But things change really quickly in high-level corporate settings, and the NFL is just that and more. And so if you're Coen, he's under 40 years old. He's still a very young coach in this league. He's put together a really impressive resume. Will Levis stinks as an NFL quarterback. When he was at Penn State, he could not beat out Sean Clifford. When he went to Kentucky, his second to last year, people were looking at him as arguably the best quarterback in that draft class if he were to declare a top 5, top 10 pick. That final year at Kentucky, he struggled a little bit, but Liam Coen played an instrumental role in his development. Liam Coen was also an offensive coordinator under Sean McVay, and we know that the Shanahan-McVay fingerprints are all across the National Football League. And then he goes to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Not easy shoes to step into. When Dave Canales leaves, we saw what Dave Canales did in resurrecting the career of Bryce Young, yet Liam Coen teams up with Baker Mayfield, and Baker completes 70% of his passes. He throws for career highs in touchdowns and passing yards. And the Jags are looking at him as the guy who can get Trevor Lawrence back on track after they gave him $250 million, and he has not come close to living up to the generational expectations that people put on him when he was coming out of Clemson. Good moments, bad moments, but he's been a little bit spotty. And so if you're Coen, you put together this resume, you're under 40 years old, you don't want to take the Jags job if you're tied to Balky because he's a dead man walking. You want to go to an organization where you can start fresh with a GM and maybe handpick that general manager. And so he didn't want to have to take that job and be forced to work with Balky. So he said, okay, I'm going to use that as leverage like anybody would, and I'm going to get this deal from Tampa Bay. And they were willing to make him the highest paid coordinator in the sport. But then the Jags, things change quickly, as I noted, fire Trent Baalke, and Shad Khan reaches back out to Liam Coen, and he basically says, we'll give you Ben Johnson money, Ben Johnson control, and you can pick your GM, and now you can team up with Trevor Lawrence. And if you're a head coaching candidate in this cycle, it's a pretty damn good situation to walk into when you know you have a quarterback with that potential, that ability, and a guy who's shown it. You just need him to be a little bit more consistent. They do have a pretty talented roster. Now you're going to get paid. You get to pick your GM, and all of a sudden it's not a bad situation. And so Coen didn't know that this was going to unfold. He didn't know that Trent Baalke was going to get fired. So the Bucs were willing to compensate him. But then the Jags, they make a switch and they fire Baalke, and Cohen's like, okay, now I get to get paid and I get to pick my GM. Yeah, I'm going to go to Jacksonville now. Now, would I have communicated that with Tampa Bay? Yes, I would have. He never signed the contract, though, so he didn't violate anything. But I wouldn't have kept that organization in the dark. And to round back to where we started, that's probably why he didn't handle it in the best way.
Kev had the stats on Saleh that I thought were pretty interesting on X. And this is it right here. So if you want to understand the value of Robert Saleh as a defensive coordinator, look at the Jets last season with and without him. Weeks 1 through 5 with Saleh, they went 2-3, but they were 5th or 6th in defensive EPA per play, 5th in EPA per pass, 14th in EPA run. But after Saleh left and it was time for Jeff Ulbrich to run the show, they fell from 6th in defensive EPA per play to 30th. And 30th EPA against the pass, 24th EPA defense against the run. I mean, that's just the bottom fell out. Does that speak to Jeff Ulbrich's inexperience? Does it speak to Saleh's genius? I mean, what do you make of the Jets with and without Robert Saleh, considering the 49ers really liked Ulbrich, and Raheem Morris obviously liked him because he rehired him to join him in Atlanta?
Yeah, shout out to Kev, because I was trying to search for these numbers a couple of days ago, and I just couldn't find them. And I knew that they were out there somewhere, but then I wasn't able to fetch them. But to me, this tells me that Robert Saleh, even though he wasn't calling plays with the Jets, played a pretty pivotal role in the game planning for that Jets defense. And I think what good coaches do They game plan well. If they call plays, obviously they call plays at a very high level. They make adjustments. They develop players. They maximize players, and they put players in a position to succeed. We saw that when Saleh was with the Niners. That 2020 year was very telling to me. That was a hell of a coaching job. Niners lost the Super Bowl in 2019. Everybody's injured in 2020. They still had one of the top defenses in the NFL. And then Saleh goes to the Jets. The defense was never the problem. It was always the offense. They never got quarterback right. And so it didn't make sense for me for Woody Johnson to fire Saleh. And I think that was proven because he gets canned. Ulbrich steps in as the interim head coach. And obviously he's the interim head coach. He's still calling the defense and has control of the defense. And he has to manage the game. And that's hard to handle all of that. But that defense fell off a cliff. And all of the strengths that I just mentioned weren't there with the Jets. And so that goes to show you the defensive mind that Saleh has. It goes to show you that the scheme does still work. And he was playing a huge role in the Jets' game plans. And without him, all of that went down the window and the numbers went down.